warm welcome to everybody this afternoon in South Africa, that is. We welcome you to this month's conversation of meaning, and we hope that it's okay with you that this is being recorded for training purposes and just to be able to share some of Chris's work beyond our time together. So I'm Nikki, and I head up the Institute for Creative Conversation in Johannesburg in South Africa, and we are passionate about narrative and pastoral work. So just wondering, before we did start, if you might like to just use the chat box and say hi and wherever you are checking in from. It would be good to know that, as well as perhaps, like Sasha is joining us from New Zealand, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. So maybe you could also let us know whether it's morning or afternoon, wherever you are. That would be great. So feel free to just use the chat box. From the UK, hi Sarah, welcome. And from Benoni in South Africa. Heidi from South Africa, Benoni. Kia ora to you too, Sasha. Pretoria, Huntington Beach, thanks Chris. Dawn from Benoni, the center of the universe. Kailami. And Dr. Joe Fillion from Pretoria. Wonderful. So welcome everybody. So I need to just share before I introduce Chris to you that Chris and I had a conversation, I think it was in 2019, Chris, if memory serves correct. Oh, wonderful. Gabriella's from the Black Forest in Germany. Welcome. And Vivian from the UK. Great. We had a chat on a podcast in 2019, and I was reflecting this morning on how that was the first time I ever used Zoom, because that was the medium you were using. And so who would have thought that 2 years later it would be like an everyday way of communicating with people. So just wanted to give you that back, that was a first for me, and look where we are now.
It's not my fault, I promise.
I'm grateful. So it's a great honor to introduce you to our crowd with us today, Chris, a colleague in the work of narrative therapy, all the way from Huntington Beach, California. Dr. Chris Hoff, a marriage and family therapist and currently director of the California Family Institute. You're in the work of creating new possibilities for people, organizations, relationships, teams, and businesses. You're an accomplished artist who's shown his work overseas, and you're also a Zen Buddhist master. And so I'm just wondering if there's anything else you might like us to know about you before we start today.
No, I think that covers a lot. There's more, but I'm sure maybe that'll come out in some of the conversation too. So,
Okay. So Nsamu is going to start our questions for this afternoon, and just to let everybody know that if time allows, we will also be opening the chat box for some more questions. Over to you.
I just want to, I want to mention that the work that you're putting out through the podcasts has been quite useful for me in the last few months. I have really enjoyed it, and I like the very fact that you call yourself the radical therapist. And perhaps to begin from there, my understanding of the word radical comes from its core root of the word root itself, the radicals, the root. How do you understand the use of the word radical therapist?
Yeah. Well, when the podcast, I'm glad. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and I appreciate seeing all the faces from all over the place, and even Sasha up at 2 a.m. in New Zealand. It's nice to see you. But the podcast, came around. I had a couple of friends that had a podcast, and which I enjoyed, and it was more politics related, and so they talked me into doing a podcast. That's how the short story. And I always had a title. I knew it was going to be The Radical Therapist, and because I was in a used bookstore at one point, and I found this book called The Radical Therapist, and I picked it up, and it was a compilation of an old journal that was around, I think, in the 1970, 71, from a kind of a rebellious group of the American Psychiatric Association, that was kind of this group of psychiatrists that were quite critical of psychiatric practices at the time, which historically, there has been a kind of a critique of, thinking of we have some people from the UK, R.D. Laing being one, some of these well-known folks that were quite critical of psychiatric practice, Foucault, for example, as well. But so when they said do the podcast, I was like, oh, I have a title that's going to be The Radical Therapist, but I stole it from the old journal. So, but to answer your question, I think there is a spirit to it, that that kind of I've always had. As a young person, I grew up. Somebody asked me to ask something about fun about myself, somebody wouldn't guess, but there's a lot of that. I probably shouldn't share, but I grew up, in the California punk rock scene, for example, which was kind of this exciting, at that time, an exciting mix of fashion and music, and just this counterculture kind of wave of stuff. And so I've always kind of held that ethic in some way, that like kind of critiquing, or kind of, this kind of rebellious kind of thing that, still I carry with me today. It's kind of evolved over time, for sure. And I think even now, sometimes even in our own practices, now I'm kind of interested in even our own practices, say like narrative therapy, for example, like what are we doing? What are we not doing? So I think that kind of radical ethic, is, I'm kind of always thinking about, right? It's just something that kind of informs me moving forward. So, yeah.
And there's something liberating about that stance on its own, isn't it? Like asking the questions, poking questions into what has become the mainstream and the establishment almost, and
they're taken for granted, for example. Yeah.
You came to therapy pretty a roundabout way.
I did, yeah. Yeah. I did. I started as I would say, I was an entrepreneur. I started a company in the mid 90s that was involved in kind of the technology world, primarily in staffing and stuff. And it grew. It was a quite successful company. And, but I was a psychology undergrad here. That's what we call it here in the States. And I had some personal experiences that I was in therapy. What had happened to me, quite honestly, I'll just tell you the story, is that I was in therapy myself, and I was with this man. He was probably at the time in his 70s. He was an ex-pastor, and had gone off and just kind of done counseling, and a friend of mine referred him to me, and I was sitting, and I went and sat with him for a while, and he was really instrumental in my life, both in my art life and in my therapy life. But I got struck with this moment of clarity one day when I was sitting in session with him, where it was like, I want to do what he's doing. And once that happened, the ball started kind of rolling, so to speak. And, you know, it got harder and harder to do the work that I was doing, just because I wasn't passionate about it, or I wasn't, you know, just wasn't, I wanted to be doing what he was doing. So I went back to school, finished up some stuff, and then I wanted to go to grad school. But I had this business, you know, what I called golden handcuffs at the time, and but was able, you know, some stuff happened in my life where it just got to the point where I couldn't put it off any longer, and I went to my business partners and said, I can't do this anymore, and I'm going back to grad school to become a therapist, and the rest is history, and here I am. Yeah, so that's how that happened.
It's an interesting. Yeah. Go on, Nikki.
Sorry, I just wanted to say that one of the statements that you make that I find quite intriguing is when you say, I believe a life can become a work of art. And I wonder in what way that it is influenced by narrative, or is it the other way around that leads you to that statement?
Yeah, well, I stole it from Foucault, but it's this idea of like, sometimes I think, well, it's what happened to me. I think I found myself kind of sleepwalking through life, and I got woken up from that in some ways, and I'm somebody that I believe you can like do a lot of different things. And you know, my career or my life, if you look at it, you know, from a higher altitude, it's you know, it's kind of all over the place. I get characterized that way, you know. I from everything to like making art to doing therapy, and I just made a little short film that got in a film festival, and so I've always kind of lived like, just do it, right? This kind of like, you know, the creative thing, you know. I think if you want to find out about something, you kind of dive into it a little bit and do these things, and you know, lives don't have to look any particular ways. And I think in narrative practice, you know, we're always, you know, kind of looking at what normalizing judgment might be hampering personal agency, right? And the creation of preferences, right? And so and so I figure I better practice what I preach, kind of thing. So I should go out and you know, when the fear shows up, oh, you're not supposed to do that, or you're not, what will people think, or you know, that kind of thing. I have to, if I'm going to help, you know, walk alongside people that are trying to do the same thing, I should be doing it myself. And that's led me in a lot of different, like, exciting experiences, quite honestly, and which I would never want to give up. Yeah.
What have some of those been?
Well, I went from, you know, no like traditional educational art background to, you know, diving in and making art and having it shown in museums, both here and in Europe, and you know, and now I have this like art community. I'm on a board for a kind of an important journal here in Los Angeles that does art criticism, and I just get to hang out with really smart people and, you know, and talented people. And I'm like, and it'd be really easy for me to suffer from imposter syndrome or something like that, right? You know, like, what am I doing here? But I just it's like, you know, Walter Mitty kind of thing. I get to show up in all these interesting places wondering, what am I doing here? And how did but enjoying it at the same time. So, yeah.
Sure. Before I hand back to you, Nsamu, I noticed that you also do what you call counseling for creatives. And so how is your own passion about art and being creative, how does that influence and inform the counseling you do? Specifically, you call it counseling for creatives.
Yeah, I think everybody's creative. I should probably qualify that. So But there are, there is a, certain, creatives in at least in my context would conclude entrepreneurs and as well as visual artists or some to that effect or something like that. And doing the work that I do, there's often the saying. Narrative therapists aren't expert in people's lives, right? I was just saying this yesterday in some supervision that I was doing. But I would also make the argument but we're pretty knowledgeable in how certain problems operate on people, right? We might not be expert on people's lives, but certain problems have kind of certain ways of, operating. And so I often tell that we're kind of experts on how problems operate. So, and in the creative world, like, at being somebody who has had the entrepreneurial experience and then had the art making experience, for example, I have kind of insider knowledge of all the fears and insecurities and all that kind of stuff that shows up that kind of talks to us while we're trying to do these things, right? And so I've also watched how those things have shut down really talented people, right? And have stopped people from, following their dreams. So, for example, or doing the thing that they would really prefer to do. And so I think it became, for me, really, going back to the why can't our lives be a work of art statement, I think it's really important for me to help as best I can support people in moving through those particular problems that want to shut down our more creative impulses, right?
Okay, thank you. And Nsamu, would you like to pick up there?
Yeah, I'm interested in how you arrived at finding that freedom, the freedom to move. It sounds to me like what you're saying now is moving away from ideas, them just being beautiful ideas, and grounding them in practice and experience.
You were kind of coming in and out for me.
Because as you were speaking, sorry, I may have frozen there for a moment.
Yeah, you did.
Right. I was saying that what I'm hearing from you is in some way you found yourself not just having beautiful ideas and thoughts and content about human behavior and many of those. And you found the freedom for yourself to ground those in some kind of practice. As a young, well, I consider myself a young therapist myself who is highly intellectual, and I can be very intellectual in many ways. I'm curious about how you found that journey to embody and ground yourself, that you're actually present and you show by example the risks that you're taking about living your life.
Oh, that's a good question, and I think I kind of want to answer it this because in that question there's this like theory and practice question, right? And how do we? I'm highly intellectual too, so that's been my struggle. But the thing I think I'm grateful for, and I hope this is capturing the question, but it feels like how I want to answer it. But regarding the practice and grounding myself in the practice, I'm in recovery. I've been clean and sober for quite some time now. And that was the start for me, quite honestly. And in recovery, it's kind of a mutual support thing, right? It's in maybe more professional terms, there's a lot of peer counseling going on in recovery. And so I was introduced to that before I was introduced to theory. So I was which I thought was kind of helpful maybe. I was introduced in kind of difficult situations, being able to sit with people and in recovery, even my own recovery and early recovery for me, right? And as my life progressed, I started to learn theory, and so, but my initial exposure was always in practice. So I'm very interested in ideas as well, and I'm interested in bringing ideas to life, right? And so, for example, something I'm interested in now, Michael White, sorry, wrote something in a piece that I really love. Is a piece on the culture of consumption, and where he talks about that if people are going to enter into liminal space. This is what I'm really fascinated with right now, so I'm just going to put it out there. Because I think this is what we're doing all the time in pastoral counseling or therapy or whatever, walking alongside people as they're entering into liminal space. And he talked about that in that article but that we had to help people. What he said in that piece that I've held on to is we have to help people have some sort of prediction of the experiences that they're going to have. And this is how these things come to life for me. And so I discovered this practice of future scenarios. I don't know if people have played around with that a little bit, and I discovered it from a group of artists that are using them in climate change work. So this is all my worlds coming together, right? I'm exposed to this practice of future scenarios by artists. I get excited about them. I see it. I'm seeing, oh, here's a possible tool to do what another map maybe to do what Michael White was talking about. How do we help people have or predict what kind of experiences they might have as they're going into liminal space? Because there's often when people walk into liminal space, and you see this often, that they turn back to what is known and familiar. That often gets characterized as self-sabotage or some other things. But so there's my ideas, but now I want to play with them in the real world, right? I think it's not enough for me just to kind of think about it, right? Or maybe I am writing about it right now, but I actually want to see in practice if these ideas hold up. So that is what I'm interested in now too. And so in my own life, maybe I'll try to get a little bit personal. The thing that really had me leave a very successful business to go off and be a therapist was a friend of mine died by suicide, and it was a very impactful event for me, and it had me take stock of my life and had me look at what do I really want to do, and I don't know, and maybe that was some imposed liminality, right? That it wasn't asked for, it wasn't something that I stepped into, but it showed up in my life, and I think from that moment on, I decided I'm not gonna, if I want to do something, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna try to do it. I'm gonna try to do these things, and I've been kind of I'm really glad that I have. And so but my Zen practice too, my Zen Buddhist practice, we're often it often gets characterized as a nihilist practice, right? But it's not really, because it's but we do confront death, and we do know that it's going to happen. So but we use it as a tool so how can we be more present, be more radically present in our own lives, lead richer lives, and because we never know, and and the clock is ticking. So those are the things that was my long-winded answer to the question, but those are some of the things that I think hopefully got at your question.
And so that invites some curiosity from me, myself included, but a lot of my colleagues and therapists in various fields have kind of seen the forced imposition of lockdown and disconnect of this this pandemic as kind of being in a bit of a liminal space because it's an unknown. So how are you exploring future scenarios with clients that might find themselves experiencing that this time of pandemic has left them in a liminal space?
Yeah, so great question. How I'm thinking about that is, oftentimes people come, I don't, and I'm sure you see this in your practice. Well, people always come to us with worst case scenarios, right? Often worst case scenarios are, running the show. And so, future scenario, or that practice, as I understand it, I'm still, playing with it, learning and all that, is that we, instead of just one particular worst case scenario, we start playing with some other scenarios. And in those scenarios, we are able to begin to craft, what kind of, it will drive the questions we ask about, what kind of, building a protagonist that can meet any kind of scenario, right? Or what will be needed if these scenarios do actually happen, what will be supportive, who will be supportive, who might we be, what might we do, right? In these particular scenarios, because I think we all have them. We all go out into the future in particular ways, right? And so if you're like me, sometimes it's not I don't go out in a great way out into the future. So to have somebody maybe sit with me and help me look at potential other scenarios. But then it's not so much about the scenario, it's about what happens in the space in between and how we talk about that, and what the questions we ask about that person that might be facing that scenario. And once they can kind of play around with some, like Michael White said, predictions of experiences they might have, it might be less likely that they'll turn away from maybe some very fruitful liminal space, right? Yeah.
So in a sense then, the future scenarios are working alongside preferred identities, ideas of preferred identities.
Absolutely, yeah, and yeah, and taking kind of some of the mystery out of it, really, right? Or maybe not the mystery, the scariness. Yeah.
Okay. Nsamu?
Talking about mystery there, it's a good way to segue into my curiosity, really. And so there's the biography. And sometimes it's tempting to think, and we work in an atmosphere where people more and more now believe in the idea that I am because of what has happened to me, and there's a lot of truth to that. I'm wondering whether there's also something else that might be happening in people's experiences that are just outside or just on the fringes of biography. So I'm curious about what you think in your own life, and also what you can speculate about what else might be happening in people's lives, my life, your life, our lives together, outside or just on the edge, or just on the boundaries of our biography.
Well, yeah. Yeah, we do live in a time, I agree with you, where we are all the things that happen to us, and that's true, and there's much more, right? And yeah, so that's a rich question that just kind of has me thinking about, because I think you're getting at, like, how do we maybe tap into the mystery? I like, maybe I have to reference Michael White again, in his ideas around trauma, and trauma creating half memories, or even half stories, or that even in the midst of terrible trauma stories, the things that have happened to us, maybe that there's always other stories, and even other stories to be created, right? Maybe not so, yes, there's always other stories of, like, if the person sitting across from you in this particular moment sharing with you some particularly bad things that have happened to them, they're also sitting across from you, and how were they able to do that, right? Like, get to that place, you know, in the midst of all of that, but also, you know, outside of that, that mystery, right? Like, what is, you know, all that mystery, and you know, and I've lived my life. I want to know. I guess it's because I just like going back to the ideas. I want to know stuff, so I'm gonna jump off. I'm a cliff jumper, so I'm gonna jump off that cliff, you know, and that served me well. And but sometimes we can't ask people to do that, right? But we can, you know, as best we can, help them, you know, maybe look around off the cliff, and you know, you have the option to jump. You don't have to, or whatever. But I try to live my life, to answer your question, that there is a ton of mystery. I operate my life with, you know, in Zen we talk about great doubt, but also great faith, which is an, you know, and which is you know, kind of runs my life. You know, like I said, that critique, that not taking things for granted, you know, questioning, you know, dominant discourses that I run with, but also I live with a great faith that, and there's an energy in that, and there's a great faith in the mystery of life, and the not knowing, right? And when I'm in that, when I'm more situated in that place, things go pretty well for me, you know.
Gabriella writes in the chat box, we are who we are also because of all the good things that have happened to us. We are who we are because of all those who love and have loved us.
Completely agree, but I don't know about you, but sometimes when the problem story is operating on me, it's hard to see that stuff, and that's why I like counselors and therapists and that kind of thing. And I think, and even conversational partners, it doesn't have to be professional, because sometimes I forget those things. Yeah. It operates on me just as much as it does the people that come to see me too. Yeah.
And that brings me to a pet curiosity of mine, which is huge actually. I believe that human beings, wonderful as we are, wonderfully created, there's a tendency for us to forget that. And maybe it was the ingenuity of history and the ingenuity of the tribe to have established rituals. These rituals that continue to remind us, even in a less intellectual level, of the wonder of our existence. And when you say that, I'm thinking about that and thinking the context of therapy, of conversations, comes that ritual of memory, of remembering.
Oh yeah, I agree. I think, especially where I am, you know, I mean, we're losing our rituals, I think, and more so now that COVID, right? For example, with the pandemic, you know, that there's no coming together and breaking bread anymore. There's no, you know, a lot of even pre-pandemic, we were losing many of our rituals, and so. But yes, so, and I agree, being able to come every week, for example. I mean, I know sometimes professional therapy gets critiqued a lot, but having a place to come every week and remember and even fantasize about the future or whatever, you know, is a ritual. We have to find those rituals now. I'm thinking, you know, the thing that concerns me, I think, is that we're having a harder and harder time doing community. There is this very strong individualistic ethic that's, you know, that's been around for a while, but I think it's just getting stronger and stronger. And the more things like a pandemic happen that isolate us even more is very, very problematic in my mind. And I think I think, you know, and I'm grateful for and I'm assuming, I know Nikki has a church community, right? For example, I have a recovery community, and I also have, you know, and a religious community, and those are, you know, I think those are now the places where ritual happens for me, right? And remembering happens for me, and I also go to therapy too. But those kinds of communities, I don't know what it's like in South Africa, for example, but in the Pew Research in the States is, you know, church attendance is down, considerably down. You know, these kinds of groups like the Rotary or the whatever, Kiwanis, I don't know if you have those out there, but you know, these kind of, we're just not meeting in community anymore, and when we are, it's behind some particularly divisive event or something like that, and I think that's kind of troubling, and I'm wondering how, because my belief is oftentimes ritual happens in community, and if our community is breaking down, what's that going to mean for our rituals? And I think it's pretty bad right now. Yeah.
And certainly in times of this pandemic, I think the invitation has been to become really creative about creating those rituals in places that we wouldn't normally, like online.
Right.
You know, having online community and online reading groups and online conversations, but there's also a wondering. Because I sense it's always been important, but perhaps more so now, in a time where, as therapists and counselors and pastoral practitioners, we're almost experiencing a lot of the same trauma around this pandemic that our clients are, the people we're seeing are. Mm-hmm. And so the importance of creating self-rituals for our self-care has become vitally important. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering what some of your rituals of self-care might be.
I was afraid you were going to ask me that question. Yeah, how do I? Well, I think create the creative process is what, you know, doing a podcast, and I don't know if anybody's seen my silly little videos that I do, you know, those kinds of things. You know, they give me an opportunity to be a little creative and to teach and to hopefully share some ideas that I'm thinking about, which really, that, you know, recharges me, right? This little film that I made that captured that kind of experience, it came out of the pandemic experience, you know, that was, you know, that's kind of that self-care for me. I don't, you know, of course I meditate. I belong to, you know, I've been a Zen Buddhist practitioner for 25 years plus now. So, you know, of course I have a meditation practice that, you know, but meditation, if you're doing it right, isn't always fun. So it's not, you know, sometimes it's hard. It's, you know, you're sitting in your own soup sometimes can be a little, you know, interesting, but I think for me, it's, you know, I started doing more videos. I started trying to be creative. That's the way, and that's the way I try to do community. I love putting the podcast. I mean, here I am talking to all of you all over the world, and this is a direct result of the podcast and that stuff, and meeting people like Nikki and Sasha, and having these experiences. I mean, it's wonderful, right? Here I am with all of you, and it's because I walked through some fear about what will people think, you know, will I sound stupid, you know, all that stuff. I walked through that, and here I am sitting with all of you. So maybe that could be the message. Right? Yeah.
So the possibilities to be in community in different ways and around the world has been a real gift, I think, to many of us. I see Sasha also saying, not Sasha, sorry, Gabriella, grateful to be able to do some work online, despite missing some of the in-person singing and art teaching and coaching. And being in the Black Forest, some of her self-care rituals, walking in the forest. How wonderful. An on-site drawing and painting in nature. Yeah. And Nsamu, I wonder if you have another question before we perhaps open up some questions for the group to ask.
I want to mention that I feel a huge amount of freedom just listening to Chris talking about stepping into this. I think what I'm hearing from you is the invitation for me to step into what is possible, as opposed to staying with wonderful ideas and being paralyzed by the fear of what other people will think of me. And that for me is an invitation to embrace multiple identities. Because if I over-identify with one identity, however wonderful that identity might be, the huge limitation to what else is possible.
Yeah, I think, and I want to qualify that this hasn't come easy for me either. I remember when I was in university, I had a speech class that I had to take, and I looked at the syllabus and I saw at the end of the class the final assignment was I was going to have to give a speech in front of the class, and I dropped the class because that was unbearable to me, right? So I've come a long way. But the thing that I think, yes, play with your identity a bit, and some of my best ideas, I think my best ideas have come from like contemporary art, right? These really creative artists that are doing this future scenarios of what I'm thinking and writing about right now, it came from some contemporary artists that are doing really interesting things. And so if I silo myself, right, and I limit what I take in, I don't know. I think I'm a much richer person because of all of the people I get to touch, and that touch me, right? And I think that's very, very important.
Almost, I have an image of a tapestry being woven together with all the different threads.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you. So I'm just wondering if anybody has a question, they might like to write it in the chat box. That they might really feel pressing a question that needs to be given voice. Now's your time to do it.
Don't be shy.
Mm-hmm.
One of the questions, as people are putting questions in the chat box, that comes to me almost all the time now when I want to do something really bold, because I consider myself quite shy, and it pretty much took me a long time to embrace a different form of being and existing. One of the questions I often ask is, what's the worst that could happen? Yeah.
Well, there's your scenario.
And two, that's right.
Yeah.
There's a scenario, and to that also is attached a sense of community. Henry Nouwen talks about it. There was a story in The Wounded Healer, and it captures this of this man who was preparing himself for a surgery, and he was terrified to go into the surgery. And then there was a young pastoral worker who didn't know how to negotiate this space. But then eventually it came out that the man readying himself for the surgery was terrified about going into the surgery, and he was also terrified to be on the other side, outside of the surgery, because he had no community on either side. He had no community in the surgery, and if he recovered, he had no community. And yeah, I was just thinking about that. The sense of community also can help to quell debilitating terrors and fears.
Yeah.
Just going to the chat box here, Gabriella says that singing lessons are also good for public speaking. Heidi asks, and I will ask, what is the best that could happen? So not just what is the worst that could happen, what is the best that could happen? Andalene says, I listened to a podcast from On Being where Rabbi Ariel Berger said, and what is a community if not a group of people who tell one another's stories? In this time when rituals and community are challenged, I appreciate how humans have found ways to gather creatively so that we can still tell each other stories.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Anybody have a question they might like to ask? If hands do go up, Natasha, I might need your help because we've spotlighted just the three of us. So while we wait for any, just a question then from me. What do you think this pandemic has done, or how has it influenced our sense of power and agency as people?
That's an interesting question. I'm giving my first ever sermon from a church pulpit at the Unitarian Church in Los Angeles this weekend, and I'm talking about, well, conspiracy theories, right? Which I don't know about where you're at, but they're pretty predominant out here in the States right now, and have caused problems because they've limited people's action. So they're definitely an influence on personal agency. So I think that this big imposed liminal space, the pandemic that has been imposed on all of us, has absolutely created or challenged our many folks' personal agency. And the way that it's doing this, I think it's, that we live in a chaotic world that is moving, that is harder and harder to understand. And I think our natural impulse is to reach for certainty. And anybody that has a good story and speaks from a certain authority of certainty is, is kind of seductive, right? And what I'm thinking about, or what I'm talking about, is how do we, and this is maybe comes from my Zen practice, but how do we let go of certainty, right? And how do we embrace uncertainty? Which leads to curiosity, which leads to questions. The best advice isn't an answer; it's a good question, right? But it's really hard to live that way when things are really scary and complex. And our natural urge is to reduce our world down to single stories, to black and white thinking, to all that kind of stuff. And I think all of that hampers personal agency in ways that I'm going to try to get at in my talk. But that's what I'm thinking about, like that this complexity, this forced complexity on us, we haven't responded really well.
No.
And we've, I think, and I'm trying to maybe blow my horn that it's okay. Somebody asked me about mystery. Heidi asked me about mystery. The mystery is in not knowing, right? The mystery is in beginner's mind, as we say in Zen, right? And what you see happening, even in the political divisiveness, is everybody has a take. Everybody, nobody's listening to each other anymore. You're all pastoral counselors and therapists and whatever, and we're, as Arthur Frank says, we are trained to be a new species of listener, and how do we not fall victim to that too, to that, or that wanting to grab onto certainty or reduction, the reductionist urge.
Yes.
But yeah, all of that I think has hampered personal agency in the midst of all of this. We have not responded well, I think, legitimately so. because we're not socialized or trained or helped in dealing with well, we are. I mean, there's lots of religious practices and stuff like that, but people aren't turning to those anymore, unfortunately. You know.
Thank you.
I'm wondering whether that has to do historically also with the fact that the world, especially since the advent of the internet, has exploded into a more global connectivity, as opposed to, and we don't know what to do with the complexity of that, as opposed to small tribal parochial living that we evolved as human beings for centuries before this explosion.
Yeah, well, yes, and in the explosion, you know, there's certain platforms that have won out, right? And in those platforms, like Twitter, for example, it's like you have to have a take and, you know, 120 characters or whatever it is. So, you know, to do well on those platforms, you have to be able to take a position, right? And that's what and you have to generate, you know, energy in that way of like divisiveness. Those platforms feed on divisiveness. They don't feed on curiosity and asking questions. The thing that drives these larger internet platforms are, quite honestly, you know, us fighting with each other.
Divisive. I'm just wondering if this isn't a good time to draw the conversation to an end. If there doesn't appear to be any questions. Heidi, I hope that Chris has answered some of your wonderings about the mystery. So failing any more questions, just perhaps a moment.
One more question, Nikki, before you finish.
Sure.
How in that environment, Chris, how do we foster conversation, generative conversations?
Yeah, so I was I'm reading Sasha's quote. Yeah, that's great, Sasha. Yeah, so how do we do that? So somebody asked me about that too. A therapist reached out to me saying that they were running into conspiracy theories. I did a little video on it. So, but anyway, but it was like there's an Agenda 21 where they believe the pandemic is this idea to depopulate the world, right? And so, you know, even, you know, we know the absent but implicit as narrative practitioners, right? Even in the midst of conspiracy theories, there is an absent but implicit. There is, if we're double listening, I would hope for, you know, folks better angels. And I might ask about, even in the midst of an Agenda 21 conspiracy theory, right? Something that this person's concerned about, the depopulation of the world, would say to me that maybe there is a care in there somewhere about what happens to people. And so how can we ask a question that would get at, and what happens to people that aren't part of this person's community, right? This is a world conspiracy theory, and this is a person that's maybe saying, I'm concerned about the world, right? Even in the midst of that conspiracy theory. So rather than saying this person is however we're going to characterize them and by whoever they voted for or whatever they did, even in the midst of that conspiracy theory, I would hope that we could find some value, some meaning, and this doesn't mean we have to reach mutual understanding, but we can be curious about a way of trying to find a way forward, right? And that there might be some values that we both hold that match up. And that might be that we both care for the world, right? Or we care for the people in the world or something like that, even in the midst of that. So even in conspiracy theories, we're listening for especially there's all different kinds. So which ones are they picking up and what is implicit in that theory, right? And I think there are opportunities there.
I think we have.
So rather than staying on the debate.
Yeah, right. Asking questions, right? Not having my own you know,
Yeah.
you're wrong,
Yeah.
here's my take. It's more about being curious about what is actually embedded in that concern, or that, what, you know, fear or whatever.
That makes me think of in South Africa, we at the moment with our vaccination finally being rolled out, kind of the vaccinators and the anti-vaxxers and
Yes, right.
and yeah, exactly.
Well,
right.
now that'll probably be what's happened here for a while. Now you're going to start hearing some of these, you know,
Yes.
the microchip and the vaccine, and you know,
That's
that
it.
kind of stuff.
Yeah. I just want to read out Sasha's comment. She says, I work with people at the end of life. The conversations I have with them frequently concern reflections on living with uncertainty, liminality, and a lack of being able to fix or solve and consider how they wish to respond. Thank you for that, Sasha.
Yeah, and talk about forced liminality, right? I mean, Sasha's, you're dealing with that all the time, right? I'm sure in those contexts. Yeah.
Well, Chris, I think we should draw our conversation to close. It's been an absolute honor and a privilege to have you with us, spend the afternoon with us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming out.
And we hope that it's the first of many conversations with you. Yeah.
Yes, please. And thank you for your great questions and just the invitation. It's been fun. It's always different. I'm always the one asking the questions, like on the podcast and stuff. So it's always interesting to be on the other side. So thank you.
And so I'm wondering how it's been, Chris.
Yeah, no, I enjoy it. You start asking me questions, you can get me talking. I'll just keep talking. So
wonderful.
Good.
Okay, yeah. So we need a second conversation soon.
Yes, please.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Have
a great day. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us.
Bye. Bye.